Good afternoon, everyone. We've finished with the NATO Defense Ministerial, and the Secretary General will now deliver a statement about those meetings, and then we'll take your questions.
Good afternoon, and it has been a very busy 24 hours. A lot has happened, and it was very good to be able to consult among NATO allies and Ukraine here at NATO. Let me begin by expressing my shock and sadness at the news coming out of Munich, where many people have been injured in what appears to have been a deliberate attack. We stand in solidarity with our ally Germany, and our thoughts are with the victims and their loved ones. Here at NATO, I was glad to welcome the new US Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, to NATO for the first time. Secretary Hegseth came with a clear message of America's enduring commitment to a strong NATO alliance and of America's clear expectations for all allies to carry their fair share of the burden. We also discussed the situation in Ukraine, together with Minister Umerov. All allies and Ukraine are united in their desire for peace in Ukraine. We all agree that we need to put Ukraine in the best possible position for negotiations. And we need a durable and lasting peace, not a Minsk III. So we had an excellent set of discussions focused on the urgent work ahead. When it comes to keeping our deterrence and defense strong, we endorsed robust defense plans drawn up by Supreme Allied Commander General Cavoli to protect our 1 billion people. To ensure we are fully ready to execute these plans, also in the future, we need more military capabilities. And for that, we need significantly more defense spending. So there is no time to waste. Our continued freedom and prosperity depend on it. Defense spending is already growing. Since 2014, European allies and Canada have added more than 700 billion additional US dollars for defense. In 2024, NATO allies in Europe and Canada invested 485 billion US dollars in defense, a 20% increase compared with 2023. With a full two-thirds of allies spending at least 2% of their GDP on defense. But we need to do more, much more, and we need to do it faster. It is clear from our discussions today that allies recognize the need to invest much more. Several announced large increases in spending in today's meeting, and I expect many ministers to return home from today's meeting with an even greater sense of urgency. We also discussed the need to ramp up defense production as we ramp up defense spending. Our industry must be able to produce what our extra money allows us to procure. We have already seen a significant increase in defense production across the alliance in recent years. We are producing more and faster than at any time in decades. But we can and must do more. To ensure the credibility of our deterrence and defense for years to come, we need to shift to a wartime mindset. And we need industry to shift with us. Industry has taken steps to improve production capacity, but they can do better. The demand signals are clear, and they'll continue to grow. Today, we agreed an updated action plan to rebuild a strong defense industry on both sides of the Atlantic. A robust defense industry will make the alliance stronger and create more jobs in Europe and North America. Allies also met with Ukraine in the NATO-Ukraine Council, and we are joined by the EU High Representative Kaja Kallas. Defense Minister Umerov briefed allies on the latest developments on the ground. And allies took note of President Trump's initiative for peace talks, which Secretary Hegseth had already outlined in our consultations within the UDCG yesterday afternoon. We discussed the importance of our continued support to Ukraine, which is crucial so that this brutal war of aggression can come to a just and lasting end. And we discussed the need for European allies and Canada to do even more. In 2024, NATO allies provided over 50 billion euros in security assistance to Ukraine. Nearly 60% of this coming from Europe and Canada. This is well above the 40 billion that we had pledged for the year. The newly established NATO command in Wiesbaden, Germany, is at the forefront of coordinating these contributions. This command is now operational and is doing important work. And allies announced new military support packages yesterday and today. This will help Ukraine in its fight today and to build up Ukraine's armed forces in the long term. All of this sends a clear signal that Europe and Canada are taking on a greater proportion of the transatlantic burden sharing. So we had an honest and forthright discussion among ourselves and with Ukraine. And we are coming out our meetings over the past 24 hours with a clear sense of purpose, commitment and urgency. And with that, I'm ready to take your questions.
All right. We'll start with Sky News.
Thank you, Deborah Haynes from Sky News.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Are all NATO allies united behind Ukraine in this, what President Zelensky has said, this belief that no negotiation on ending the war can take place without Ukraine at the table? And are allies united that Ukraine cannot be forced into an agreement unless it actually accepts the conditions?
What we are clearly united about is that, first of all, we have to make sure that when talks start, Ukraine is in the best possible position. And obviously this is about Ukraine, so Ukraine will be involved in any way and whatsoever. And at the same time, we are also in total agreement that an outcome has to be durable. As Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, said yesterday, we cannot have a Minsk III again. So whenever the outcome is there, we have to make sure that Putin will not try to grab another square mile, kilometer of Ukraine.
All right, we'll go to Reuters.
Thank you very much, Secretary General. You have said repeatedly that Ukraine needs to be put in a position of strength before talks could start. But President Trump has said that talks are starting immediately. So does that mean that Ukraine is now starting negotiations from a position of weakness?
No, and I do not completely agree with you, because what will happen, of course, even if talks start, they will not end on day one or day two. So there is, let's say, a path there where we have to make sure that talks are successful, and it is important that we get to a peace deal, and at the same time to make sure that Putin understands that the West is united, that Ukraine is getting all the support it needs to prevail. That is very important, but also that he understands that we will only conclude those talks when we are absolutely assured that the outcome can be sustained, that the outcome is enduring, is lasting.
All right, RBC, Ukraine.
Milan Lilic, RBC Ukraine News Agency. Secretary General, do you believe that Vladimir Putin really wants to end the war now, as President Trump said it yesterday? Thank you.
Well, I don't know what is exactly in President Putin's mind, of course, neither can you. I have had many meetings with him between 2010 and 2014 in my previous role. He is a strong negotiator. He is very unpredictable. But in the end, if we want to get to a peace deal, we need him there because he was the one starting this war of aggression against your country. So we have to make sure that we navigate those talks in a way that the outcome is such that it is clear to the whole world that there is a strong deal, that also the Indo-Pacific countries like China, but also a country like North Korea, and even in the Middle East, Iran, know that it is the West which is prevailing.
BBC. In the center, we'll get the mic to you.
Thank you. Your voice is so commanding, you don't need it.
Yeah, Jonathan Beale, BBC.
Hi.
Boris Pistorius, the German defense minister, said it was regrettable that the Trump administration had made concessions before negotiations had begun. Similar message from the EU Foreign Policy Chief, Kaja Kallas. Not a good idea. Would you agree with them?
Well, I'm not in a position to comment on everything everybody is saying, but I would not be surprised about President Trump's views on this. He has been clear during the election campaign, and we knew for a couple of days that talks were imminent, at least that a phone call with President Putin was imminent, and that phone call took place yesterday. And now we have to make sure collectively that we do everything to make sure that we get to a lasting outcome of those talks.
All right. Moscow Times, please.
Thank you. Secretary General, many experts say that after yesterday's President Trump's speech, that the agreement, if it might be signed, the peace agreement, if it might be signed in the way, in the tone which was articulated by the Washington, will make Moscow and President Putin stronger, and it might lead to President Putin's decision that he can challenge some other countries. If yes, do you agree with this, and who he might challenge or attack, as experts say?
Well, I have not seen the outcome of peace negotiations. They have not even started. What I know is that all allies here today, and I know that the White House thinks the same, are of the opinion that we have to make sure, yes, that there is peace in Ukraine, that we end this awful situation, this war of aggression where hundreds of thousands of people have now been dead or seriously injured on both sides of the border. And it is really horrible. So we want to end this. But of course you have to make sure that you conduct those talks in a way where the outcome is such that it will not be seen as a loss to the West, one, and two, that we make sure that the outcome is seen as enduring, that it will not be challenged again, like we have seen after Crimea and after the Minsk Accords in 2014, where immediately basically moving forward to 2015 and 2016, Putin started to challenge the outcome of these agreements.
Bloomberg, behind the cameras.
Secretary General, this is Andrea Pallasciano from Bloomberg. President Trump has said that negotiations are effectively starting. Europeans are not in the conversation right now. They're not at the table. What can European allies, European NATO allies do to get back in the conversation? And what exactly can they offer? What can they put on the table to be included in these discussions?
Well, clearly we are intensely consulting amongst each other, including with the United States. I will be myself in Munich tomorrow, meeting with Vice President Vance, Kellogg, the special representative for Ukraine, special representative for President Trump, will be here at NATO on Monday. Yesterday I had dinner with Pete Hegseth, the new Secretary of Defense of the United States. So we are, as NATO, and the teams are, of course, intensely coordinating. And I know that many allies and many EU member states are doing the same with Washington. So we are really, and what we did the last 24 hours was also very much about getting to the same page. And this is a democratic alliance. You do not always start with concurring positions. But in these 24 hours, what I have seen was a tremendous sense of unity and of convergence of views, and maybe not on everything and every detail, but still an alliance moving united forward.
All right, staying in the same part of the room, woman in the white blouse and beige vest.
Good afternoon. My name is Julia Sarivan. I'm from Republic of Moldova, representing here Journal TV. So, Mr. Rutte, last night the airspace of the Republic of Moldova was overflown by Russian drones. Some of them even exploded on the Moldovan territory, which is very serious and endangers the lives of our citizens. What can allies do to help Moldova to protect its airspace? Because it's really dangerous right now, and as we speak, Moldovan citizens are in danger.
Well, as you know, many allies, I hosted Maia Sandu, the president of Moldova, here myself in late 2024, I think it was in December, So we are having a lot of talks and consultations. And many allies are also bilaterally supporting Moldova. The European Union is very much involved because we all care about your beautiful country. And to make sure that you prevail in this ongoing, let's say, yeah, you would call it hybrid in the past, but this is really destabilization campaigns and sometimes even state-sponsored terrorism against your country. And this is what we are doing, working together on this, consulting, and making sure that we are on the same page. That is very important.
All right, and just behind her, Frankfurt Allgemeine Zeitung.
Thanks a lot, Thomas Kutschka with Frankfurt Allgemeine Zeitung. Secretary General, yesterday the US Secretary of Defense also said that in the future Europeans need to take ownership of their own, as he said, conventional security. How do you read this? Does it mean that we should expect the bulk of the US forces in Europe, which are about 100,000 at the moment, will be withdrawn from the continent? Did you discuss this with him? Did you get any assurances? And would it be wise for Europeans to basically foresee a situation where the US only provides a nuclear umbrella, but no longer any conventional protection? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. And you know, Pete Hegseth visited Stuttgart on Tuesday. And on a question, I think, by you or one of your colleagues said that there are no plans to reduce troop levels. That's one. At the same time, the US is quite irritated, basically for a long time, and Trump made this very clear when he came on board in 2016, 2017, about the fact that the US is spending much more on defense than the average is in the rest of NATO, in Canada and in Europe. So we have to do more. Last year we spent 20% more. US NATO allies. So if you take out US from the numbers, the rest of NATO spend 20% more. So we can do this. But it is not nearly enough. When you look at the capability targeting process, and when you then from there start to see the emerging gaps, it has to be much and much more than this famous 2%. It will be more than 3% at least. So here he is right. And the good thing, of course, is when we in the rest of NATO spend more, that there will be more of a burden sharing with what the US is doing, because the US itself is now on about 3.3, 3.4, 3.5%, depending on which year and how you calculate it. So that burden shift is necessary. But to your concrete question, I think Pete Hegseth was very clear in Stuttgart.
Let's see, here. Woman in the second row.
Yuri Bilat, Holland Media, Russian Media in Exile. I wanted to ask you about, like yesterday NATO already did what Putin wanted, dropped off the idea of Ukraine membership in alliance in the foreseeable future. If this is how NATO will make Putin to start the talking process, but just give him what he wants?
Well, listen, in Washington again, NATO committed to future NATO membership for Ukraine. But it has never been agreed that whenever peace talks would start, that peace talks would end anyway and always and definitely with NATO membership. That has never been agreed. It could be, but it never was that clearly stated. What I consistently have said is we have to make sure that whatever the outcome is, we have to make sure that Vladimir Putin will never, ever try again to attack Ukraine. That is crucial. And then you and I, as I said yesterday, we can spend time, and not for a long time, I think in 10 minutes, we can think of 5 or 10 ways to make sure that we have those guarantees in place for Ukraine going forward. But there has never been a promise to Ukraine that as part of a peace deal, they would be in NATO.
All right, and now we'll go to the woman in the black jacket.
Lucrezio, Rai Italian Public Television. U.S. Secretary of Defense said that U.S. are interested towards Indo-Pacific and China more than Europe. So, European Union states, they are a little bit concerned about this. What do you think about?
Spend more. Spend more. And those not on 2% get to the 2% by this summer. And those on 2% prepare for much, much more. And it will be north of 3%. Because what is behind this is two things. One is the genuine issue that the US has to concentrate on multiple theaters, including on the Indo-Pacific. Absolutely. China, etc. It is a great worry for them. And rightly so. But also a continuous debate they're having with European allies. Hey guys, we are spending over 3%, 3.5% on average in the US, and you are close to 2% or not even at 2% in the rest of NATO. So they are right. They have every right to be extremely irritated because we are saying, yeah, but spending more, that might mean maybe saving somewhere else or increased taxation or, yeah, hey, guess what? That's the same for the US. When you spend 3.5% on defense, then you cannot spend it on your pensions or you cannot lower your taxes by that amount. So they're absolutely clear. So I think these two things come together. US has to concentrate on Europe, yes, but also on other issues. And by the way, when it comes to the Indo-Pacific, and many allies today made that point, these theaters get more and more interconnected with North Korea, China and Iran backing up Putin, particularly North Korea and China being over there in the Pacific region. As I said before to you, I have sometimes more phone calls coming out of Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand from senior politicians there than from some NATO allies. So they're really worried about what's happening there. They want us to work closer together. And I also said today, if the US, rightly so, sees China and other emerging situations in the Indo-Pacific as an emerging threat to that country, then we have to face that together. Not that NATO is now expanding to the Indo-Pacific, but then you have to work together as an alliance how to make sure that those security threats of the US are also a concern for us here in Europe.
NHK.
Satya from NHK, the public TV station in Japan, thank you. Kind of following up on my colleague's question, do you expect the IP4 countries to be spending more on defense, considering these situations?
Well, of course, what I'm really doing in NATO is to make that push for more spending. It's not up to me, of course, to advise Japan or Korea or Australia or New Zealand on their spending levels, but your country has now a prime minister and a foreign minister and a defense minister. The defense minister is defense minister, and the foreign minister and the prime minister are former defense ministers. So you have the three most involved politicians in the cabinet really being very much, and I was on the phone with the Prime Minister recently, and we totally agreed on the importance of working together. But of course, it is not up to me to now even move outside NATO territory and start to lecture the whole world that they have to spend more on defense.
All right, we have time for just a few more. BBC Russian service.
Thank you very much. Firstly, just to follow up, you thought it was clear that this call that happened between Putin and Trump was imminent and you knew about this. Should we take it as a sign that you and other allies knew beforehand, before this call happened, that like Trump was going to talk to Putin? And do you think that the position that he shared with Mr. Putin, was it just American position, or was it, you know, like something that everybody agreed on? This is my first question.
So I first answer that question,
okay,
then
sure,
we go to your second question.
Sure.
Now, what I said is we always knew that this week that call was imminent, not exactly at that particular time slot. It's not that detailed that we consult with each other, but we knew a call would happen soon. It was imminent, and teams are consulting each other. That doesn't mean that we always consult in detail about all the talking points in each of the phone calls each of the leaders within NATO is making. But of course, there is a large sense of sharing what each of us is doing.
Okay, and my second question is, President Zelensky said today that there's a huge risk that the negotiations and just the conversation about the future of Ukraine and Europe could turn into bilateral US-Russia conversation. And I think it's not a secret that Vladimir Putin wants to see something like the second Yalta, you know, like the situation where he sits with an American president and they decide on the fate of the whole world. And it feels that in the last 2 days, the risk that Europe will be excluded, Europe and Ukraine will be excluded from this conversation became much higher. What do you think about this?
Well, first of all, the first one President Trump called after he was on the phone with Putin was President Zelensky. They talked for an hour. Tomorrow, President Zelensky will meet with Vice President Vance. I will myself have talks tomorrow with President Zelensky in Munich. So we are closely coordinating between the US and also Ukraine and, of course, European allies.
All right, and just behind her, the blonde woman.
Tanja Komarica, Serbia. What are the key challenges in NATO's relation with the non-member countries in the Western Balkan, and how does NATO plan to strengthen cooperation with these countries?
Well, obviously, we are very much involved, as you know, in Kosovo through KFOR. We are also closely following and being helpful, trying to be helpful in Bosnia-Herzegovina. I myself have excellent relations with all the leaders in the region, thanks to my previous role, including President Vučić of Serbia. So we are in constant contact, making sure that whatever we can do to contribute to stabilizing the region, we do. We have just had the Kosovo elections. The electoral committee still has to decide, I think, on the exact outcome, but we have seen the trend. It might probably mean that you will have a coalition now in Kosovo. And that political process, of course, has to take place, as is normal in a democracy. But we are closely connecting and following everything happening there. And as you know, the Deputy Secretary General is also from the Western Balkans. She is from North Macedonia, and she is a great advisor on all these issues.
All right, Echo.
Artem Besiedin, ECHO. So if, as we see, negotiation may start soon, maybe in this half year or year, does that mean that member states are effectively accepting the suspended status of the annexed territories? How does it align with statements supporting Ukraine's sovereignty? Does that mean that NATO accepts all these territories are controlled by Russia forever?
Well, again, what I said before, we want peace. We want to make sure that when the talks really get underway, that you guys are, sorry, the Ukrainians, but I know you're in exile. I'm not sure whether you live in Ukraine now, but at least that Ukrainians are in the best possible position to conduct those talks. And that whatever the outcome is, that we make sure that it is the full stop. And that Russia will never try again. And really are consulting with our allies here in Europe, with the Canadians, and particularly, of course, with the Americans. As I said myself, I will have many meetings with senior American officials in person in Munich and here in Brussels, but of course also on the phone. And that is important. So that, because we all have that wish that we will get to a durable peace in Ukraine, but that we try to do it in a way that it is indeed enduring, lasting. And of course, President Zelensky himself is very much part of all those conversations.
All right, gentlemen in the front and center.
Raf Sanchez, NBC News. Secretary General, you said the NATO alliance is united around the goal of putting Ukraine into the strongest possible position going into these negotiations. But did Secretary Hegseth explicitly confirm to you that that is the American position? Because the way President Trump was speaking yesterday, it sounded to many people like he sees the United States as essentially a neutral mediator in these talks.
No, but you know that the US is one of the biggest suppliers of military aid into Ukraine, which is still ongoing. And what is very important, of course, here is that going forward, and I've said that before, I expect the US for the European allies to take a bigger share of the financial burden. That might be the case, and I would not be surprised, because the US has paid a lot of money. And luckily, over 2024, what we have seen is that now the European part of NATO is taking about 60% of the burden in terms of the money involved. And going forward, I expect the US to, for the Europeans to step up even further.
All right, and final question. Gentleman in the beige jacket.
Secretary, thank you for this opportunity. Secretary Hegseth said yesterday that the idea of putting boots on the ground involving the US troops in Ukraine is off the table. Do other NATO allies share the same idea? And if NATO is not involved in this type of security guarantee for Ukraine, what can we expect from NATO? Because we're fighting that war.
Yes, I understand that. But why do you guys want to discuss in a press conference the exact configuration of what a lasting peace deal would look like? Including this, and you were right on this, the security guarantees which have to be part of that. Because, as I said before, you can have many discussions on how to do that. It could be NATO, it could be not be NATO, it could be individual countries helping. There are many ways to do that. But to go into that in detail, the only thing we will be doing is informing Vladimir Putin. And he is sitting in that reclining chair listening to what I'm answering to your question if I would give you the answer in full. And I won't, because I don't want to make him any wiser.
That's exactly what the US Defense Secretary has done.
What he said is he made very clear the US position on yes or not NATO as part of a peace deal. And he is totally entitled to do that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That's all we have time for.
Threats to treaty allies should deterrence fail. Second, the U.S. is committed to building a stronger, more lethal NATO. However, we must ensure that European and Canadian commitment to Article 3 of this treaty is just as strong. Article 3 says that allies, and I quote, by means of continuous and effective self-help and mutual aid, will maintain and develop their individual and collective capacity to resist armed attack. Leaders of our European allies should take primary responsibility for defense of the continent, which means security ownership by all allies, guided by a clear understanding of strategic realities, and it's an imperative given the strategic realities that we face. And that begins with increasing defense spending. 2% is a start, as President Trump has said, but it's not enough. Nor is 3%, nor is 4%, more like 5%. Real investment, real urgency. We can talk all we want about values. Values are important. But you can't shoot values. You can't shoot flags, and you can't shoot strong speeches. There is no replacement for hard power. As much as we may not want to like the world we live in some cases, there's nothing like hard power. It should be obvious that increasing allied European defense spending is critical, as the President of the United States has said. Also critical is expanding our defense industrial base capacity on both sides of the Atlantic. Our dollars, our euros, our pounds must become real capabilities. The U.S. is fully committed under President Trump's leadership to pursue these objectives in the face of today's threats. Yesterday, I had a chance to attend the Ukraine Defense Contact Group. Today, participated in both the NATO Ministerial and the Ukraine Council. In both, we discussed Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. I had the chance to brief allies on President Trump's top priority, a diplomatic, peaceful end to this war, as quickly as possible, in a manner that creates enduring and durable peace. The American Defense Department fully supports the efforts of the Trump administration. And we look to allies to support this important work with leading on Ukraine security assistance now through increased contributions and greater ownership of future security assistance to Ukraine. To that end, I want to thank my UK counterpart, Defense Secretary John Healey for hosting this Ukraine Defense Contact Group and for his leadership on support of Ukraine. President Trump gave me a clear mission: achieve peace through strength, as well as put America first, our people, our taxpayers, our borders, and our security. We are doing this by reviving the warrior ethos, rebuilding our military, and reestablishing deterrence. NATO should pursue these goals as well. NATO is a great alliance, the most successful defense alliance in history. But to endure for the future, our partners must do far more for Europe's defense. We must make NATO great again. It begins with defense spending, but must also include reviving the transatlantic defense industrial base, rapidly fielding emerging technologies, prioritizing readiness and lethality, and establishing real deterrence. Finally, I want to close with this. After World War II, first General and then President Eisenhower was one of NATO's strongest supporters. He believed in a strong relationship with Europe. However, by the end of Eisenhower's presidency, even he was concerned that Europe was not shouldering enough of its own defense, nearly making, in Eisenhower's words, quote, a sucker out of Uncle Sam. Well, like President Eisenhower, this administration believes in alliances, deeply believes in alliances. But make no mistake, President Trump will not allow anyone to turn Uncle Sam into Uncle Sucker. Thank you, and we're glad to take some questions.
Thanks very much. Let's start with the U.S. traveling TV pool with Liz Verdun.
Thank you, Secretary Hegseth. You have focused on what Ukraine is giving up. What concessions will Putin be asked to make?
Well, I would start by saying the arguments that have been made that somehow coming to the table right now is making concessions to Vladimir Putin outright that we otherwise, or that the President of the United States shouldn't otherwise make. I just reject that at its face. There's a reason why negotiations are happening right now, just a few weeks after President Trump was sworn in as President of the United States. Vladimir Putin responds to strength. In 2014, he invaded Crimea, not during the presidency of Donald Trump. Over 4 years, there was no Russian aggression from 2016 to 2020. In 2022, Vladimir Putin took aggression on Ukraine. Once again, not while President Trump was President of the United States. So any suggestion that President Trump is doing anything other than negotiating from a position of strength is on its face ahistorical and false. So when you look at what he may have to give or take, what's in or what's out in those negotiations, we have the perfect deal maker at the table from a position of strength to deal with both Vladimir Putin and Zelensky. No one's going to get everything that they want. Understanding who committed the aggression in the first place. But I challenge anyone else to think of a world leader at this moment who, with credibility and strength, could bring those two leaders to the table and forge a durable peace that ultimately serves the interests of Ukraine, stops the killing and the death, which Trump has been clear he wants to do, and hopefully ultimately is guaranteed by strength of Europeans who are there prepared to back it up.
Why not invoke Article 5 then for the NATO peacekeeping forces that could potentially be deployed? How does that deter President Putin?
Well, I would say, I want to be clear about something as it pertains to NATO membership not being realistic outcome for negotiations. That's something that was stated as part of my remarks here, as part of a coordination with how we're executing these ongoing negotiations, which are led by President Trump. All of that said, these negotiations are led by President Trump. Everything is on the table in his conversations with Vladimir Putin and Zelensky. What he decides to allow or not allow is at the purview of the leader of the free world, of President Trump. So I'm not going to stand at this podium and declare what President Trump will do or won't do, what will be in or what will be out, what concessions will be made or what concessions are not made. I can look, as our team has, of what's realistic, likely on an outcome. I think realism is an important part of the conversation that hasn't existed enough inside conversations amongst friends. But simply pointing out realism, like the borders won't be rolled back to what everybody would like them to be in 2014, is not a concession to Vladimir Putin. It's a recognition of hard power realities on the ground after a lot of investment and sacrifice, first by the Ukrainians and then by allies, and then a realization that a negotiated peace is going to be some sort of demarcation that neither side wants. But it's not my job as the Secretary of Defense to define the parameters of the President of the United States as he leads some of the most complex and consequential negotiations in the world.
Sticking with the U.S. press, let us go with Axios' Zach Basu, right in the far right.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Given the position you've now staked out, what leverage exactly is Ukraine being left with, especially if the U.S. also plans to wind down its military aid? And then quickly, if a NATO ally is attacked by Russia or any country, will the U.S. unequivocally uphold its obligations under Article 5, regardless of that country's
Well, we've said
spending?
we're committed to the alliance, and that's part of the alliance, right? You point out Article 5, you point out Article 3. It's just a cheap, I'm not saying it's cheap coming from you, but it's just a cheap political point to say, oh, we've left all the negotiating cards off the table by recognizing some realities that exist on the ground. President Zelensky understands the realities on the ground, President Putin understands the realities on the ground, and President Trump, as a deal maker, as a negotiator, understands those dynamics as well. By no means is anything that I state here, even though we lead the most powerful military in the world, hemming in the commander-in-chief in his negotiations to ultimately decide where it goes or does not go. Well, he's got all the cards he would like. And the interesting part is, oftentimes, while the conventional status quo mindset or the legacy media wants to play checkers, the same checkers game we've been playing for decades, President Trump, time and time again, finds a way to play chess. As a deal maker, as a businessman who understands how to create realities and opportunities where they otherwise may not exist. Take, for example, the conversations that our Treasury Secretary had in Kiev recently with President Zelensky, which will continue in Munich with our Vice President and Secretary of State, around investments and resources inside Ukraine. I don't want to get ahead of any decision or announcement that could be made there. It could be any number of parameters. But President Trump, as a deal maker and a businessman, recognizes that an investment relationship with Ukraine, ultimately in the long term for the United States, is a lot more tangible than any promises or shared values we might have, even though we have them. There is something to relationships and deals in real ways, whether militarily or economically or diplomatically, that he sees that are possibilities that could forge together a lot of opportunities to show that solidarity that Vladimir Putin will clearly recognize. That's one of any number of other opportunities that this president will leverage in these high-stakes negotiations. So I just reject on its face the premise that somehow President Trump isn't dealing with a full set of cards when he's the one that can determine ultimately what cards he holds.
Great. Now shifting to the international press, we'll take the French wire service Agence France Presse with Max Delaney.
Thank you very much. Secretary of Defense, you've spoken about trying to force both Putin and Zelensky to the table. Can you give a guarantee that no deal will be forced on Ukraine that they do not want to accept, and also that you will include Europe in the negotiations about an issue that concerns European security? And can you tell us whether the US will continue to supply arms to Ukraine during any negotiations?
Well, to the first part of your question, that's not ultimately my decision. The President will lead these negotiations alongside our Secretary of State, our National Security Advisor, and numerous other officials that will be involved. And ultimately, we've played our role in talking to our NATO allies about what that would look like. President Trump, I want to point out, I've got the truths right here that he posted, called both, in case we missed it, Vladimir Putin and President Zelensky. Called them both. Any negotiation that's had will be had with both. I also am very encouraged by what the Secretary General has said here. Clearly attuned to the realities of the moment, the need for peace, and that the NATO alliance and European members will play a role in that. Ultimately, President Trump speaking to those two countries is central to the deal being made, but it affects a lot of people, of course. So I'm not going to be involved in those intimate diplomatic negotiations. That's for the pros atop the Trump administration who do diplomacy and negotiations. Ultimately, as security assistance, we have continued to provide what has been allocated. I think it would be fair to say that things like future funding, either less or more, could be on the table in negotiations as well. Whatever the president determines is the most robust carrot or stick on either side to induce a durable peace, understanding, obviously, the motivations that Vladimir Putin has had on Ukraine for quite some time. Thank you.
We'll have a second international press outlet. We'll go with the German paper Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung with Dr. Thomas Kutschka.
Thanks a lot, Thomas Kutschka, Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. Good afternoon. Mr. Secretary, 2 questions, please. The first one regarding the new defense investment pledge. When you and President Trump speak about raising it to 5%, do you mean European allies only, or do you mean the US as well, which is currently at 3.4% according to NATO statistics? And if the latter is true, when do you think the US could possibly reach the goal of spending 5% on defense? That's number one. Number two, you've said yesterday that Europeans need to take ownership of their own conventional security. So should Europeans expect that ultimately the US would withdraw the bulk of their forces from Europe and just leave in place what is necessary for nuclear deterrence? I know there's a revision going on. I don't expect you to name any numbers, but maybe give us an outlook of what we should expect. Thank you.
Thank you. I think nobody can or should contest the extent of America's willingness to invest in national security. We have a budget of $850 billion spent on defense. I'm in the business of ensuring that every dollar of that is used wisely, which is why we're pushing a Pentagon audit and making sure that we're cutting fat so that we've got more at the tip of the spear. 3.4% is a very robust investment, larger than most of our allies within NATO. Any defense minister or secretary of defense that tells you they wouldn't want more would be lying to you. I understand that. Ultimately, we have our own budgetary considerations to be had, but I don't think an unwillingness of NATO allies to invest in their own defense spending can be dismissed away by trying to point at the $900 billion that America has invested around the globe to include the NATO alliance and saying that's not enough. So ultimately, we are very much committed to the NATO alliance and to our allies, but without burden sharing, without creating the right set of incentives for European countries to invest, then we would be forced to attempt to be everywhere for everybody all the time, which in a world of fiscal restraints is, again, to get back to that word reality, just not reality. So yes, we will continue to spend robustly. Our expectation of our friends, and we say this in solidarity, is you have to spend more on your defense, for your country, on that continent, understanding that the American military and the American people stand beside you as we have in NATO, but can't have the expectation of being the permanent guarantor, as I alluded to, from what even Eisenhower observed post-World War II. That shift has to happen. The peace dividend has to end. There are autocrats with ambitions around the globe, from Russia to the communist Chinese. Either the West awakens to that reality and creates combat multipliers with their allies and partners, to include NATO, or we will abdicate that responsibility to somebody else with all the wrong values. You mentioned Europe. We have not said in any way that we're abandoning our allies in Europe. There have been no decisions based on troop levels. Again, that's a discussion to be had by the commander-in-chief in these high-stakes negotiations. And that would most likely come later on. But there is a recognition that the ambitions of the communist Chinese are a threat to free people everywhere, to include America's interests in the Pacific. And it makes a lot of sense, just in a common sense way, to use our comparative advantages. European countries spending here in defense of this continent, in defense of allies here, against an aggressor on this continent with ambitions. That strikes me as the right place to invest. And I don't say that in a condescending way. I say that in a common sense, practical way. Investing in defense on the continent makes sense. We support that as well. It also makes sense comparatively and geographically for the United States, along with allies in the Pacific, like Japan and South Korea and the Philippines and Australia and others, to also invest in allies and partners and capabilities in the Pacific to project power there in service of deterrence. That deterrent effect in the Pacific is one that really can only be led by the United States. We wish we could lead everywhere at all times. We will stand in solidarity with allies and partners and encourage everyone to invest in order to have force multiplication of what we represent, but it requires realistic conversations. Those with disingenuous motives in the media, I don't mean to look at you, I'm just saying anyone that suggests its abandonment are trying to drive a wedge between allies that does not exist. We are committed to that NATO alliance. We understand the importance of that partnership, but it can't endure on the status quo forever in light of the threats we face and fiscal realities. Europe has to spend more, NATO has to spend more, has to invest more, and we're very encouraged by what the Secretary General has said. And frankly, behind closed doors, what a lot of our allies have said as well, acknowledging that reality. And that's why when I say make NATO great again, it's what President Trump set out to do in 2017. The press said President Trump is abandoning NATO. He's turning his back on our NATO allies. That's what the headlines read in 2017 and 2018. What actually happened? That tough conversation created even more investment to the point where now almost every NATO country is meeting the 2% goal that was said to be egregious when he first said it. Now European countries are stepping up, and President Trump continues to ring the alarm bell that even more investment is required considering where we are. So suggestions of abandonment otherwise continue to be disingenuous, and we are proud to be part of this alliance and stand by it.
Sir,
I'll take a couple more. Sure.
Why don't we take one from a U.S. outlet and one from an international outlet? With the U.S. outlet, pardon me, sir, what we're going to take from the U.S. is Logan Rattick from Newsmax, please.
You talked about expanding the defense industrial base and also expediting foreign military sales. Can you expand on that a little bit and how important that is to NATO?
Well, one of the self-evident conclusions of the war in Ukraine was the underinvestment that both the European continent and America has had, unfortunately, in the defense industrial base. The ability to produce munitions, emerging technologies, rapidly and field them was a blind spot exposed through the aggression against Ukraine. Ukraine has responded to that, as we've had a chance to listen to a great deal. Europe is responding to that, and so is America. We have to do more to ensure, whether you call it the arsenal for democracy or defending the free world, if America can't build and export and build and provide rapid capabilities because we're too stale or static or bureaucratic or the Pentagon is bloated, then we're not able to field the systems we need in the future. So deep and dramatic reforms are coming at the Defense Department with the leadership of President Trump. to ensure that we're investing robustly in our defense industrial base. A great example is shipbuilding. We need to vastly increase our ability to build ships and submarines, not just for ourselves, but to honor obligations to our allies as well. And we will do that. Foreign military sales is another thing I mentioned this morning with the Secretary General. We have, for a long time, been the country by, with, and through that our allies are able to supply major platforms and weapon systems like the F-35 and the Patriots and others. Whatever the system is, we need to reform that process so it's quicker. So a request today isn't delivered 7 years from now, but 3 years from now with less red tape and with the most efficient and effective technology possible. We hear that from our allies, and that's part of being a good faith partner, is we're gonna invest in our defense industrial base, we're gonna make sure foreign military sales are as rapid as possible, which again is a force multiplier for American power, which is something we wanna do in a contested world.
For our final question, we'll go to an international outlet, the Japanese service NHK, with Tsuchiyo Sugita, please.
Sachio from NHK, the Japanese TV station. Thank you very much. I would like to ask about China. As you mentioned that U.S. will be prioritizing in deterring China. What role will you be expecting like Japan and IP4 countries to play in this context?
Sure. I mean, first of all, I would point out that President Trump has expressed a strong relationship with Xi Jinping. We don't have an inevitable desire to clash with China. There's a recognition that there are divergent interests which lead to a need for strength on the American side to ensure our interests are advanced, and that ultimately any aggression is deterred. That's a real thing, but we don't feel like conflict is inevitable and certainly don't seek conflict with China, and that's why President Trump has that good relationship with Xi Jinping. But it was prudent for us to work with allies and partners in the Pacific to ensure that that deterrence, hard power deterrence, not just reputational, but reality, exists. And that's why a lot of my first phone calls as Secretary of Defense were to Pacific allies, to Australia, to Japan, to South Korea, to the Philippines, and others, and will continue, because that, just as this alliance in Europe is critical, working by, with, and through allies and partners in that region who understand the reality of the ascendant Chinese threat will be critical. It can't be America alone. It won't be America alone if we are to deter that. So it is a focus. I've articulated that from day one. America achieves strength, whether it's in peace through the Ukrainian conflict or deterring it in the Pacific through strength. There's a reason why Donald Trump emphasizes peace through strength at every moment. My job alone as the Secretary of Defense is to ensure he has the strongest, most capable, most lethal military possible. Heaven forbid we have to use it. It's meant and built for deterrence, but if we have to, we can close with and destroy our enemies and bring our men and women home with success as quickly as possible. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, everyone.